Hello, darling. I was thinking some stuff, and it seemed worth sharing. I was thinking about Roy Jenkins and his remarkable work to create a more civilised society. I was born in the mid-60s. My dad was 36 when I was born, and my mum was 31. I look back at pictures of them at the time, and they look like they were enjoying the 60s before I came along. They were old enough to know who they were and to know what they liked. They liked living in London, and they liked its jazz clubs and its theatres. They liked eating in restaurants and going to parties. Politically speaking, I think my parents were left of centre, but more centre than left. When I was born, the Labour Party was in government. The Prime Minister was Harold Wilson, and the Home Secretary was a man called Roy Jenkins. 15 years later, when I was a schoolboy, Roy Jenkins was one of the Gang of Four who split from the Labour Party and founded the SDP, and so his name was in the news, but at the age of 15, that name was new to me. I'd never heard of him. I recall my parents being surprised about that. I had no idea who he was and what he'd done back in the 60s. I had no idea how much I owed him, how much we all do in the UK. Roy Jenkins was born in 1920 and first became an MP in 1948. He was also a writer, specialising in biographies of great politicians from history. In 1959, Penguin wanted to release 3 books, putting the case for each of the main political parties in the upcoming election. And they turned to Roy Jenkins to write The Labour Case. The last chapter of that book was called Is Britain Civilised? Jenkins wrote, "This chapter is about the need to make this country a more civilised place in which to live. It concerns many subjects which are normally regarded as outside the scope of party politics. But they are nevertheless at least as important as many of the matters which are regularly chewed over by party propagandists." There are 3 aspects to the discussion. Firstly, there is the need for the state to do less to restrict personal freedom. Secondly, there is the need for the state to do more to encourage the arts, to create towns which are worth living in, and to preserve a countryside which is worth looking at. Thirdly, there is the need, independently of the state, to create a climate of opinion which is favourable to gaiety, tolerance and beauty, and unfavourable to puritanical restriction, to petty-minded disapproval, to hypocrisy, and to a dreary, ugly pattern of life. A determined drive in these 3 directions would do as much to promote human happiness as all the political legislation which any government is likely to introduce. Let us be on the side of those who want people to be free to live their own lives, to make their own mistakes, and to decide, in an adult way, and provided they do not infringe the rights of others, the code by which they wish to live. And on the side of experiment and brightness, of better buildings and better food, of better music, jazz as well as Bach, and better books, of fuller lives and greater freedom. In the long run, these things will be more important than the most perfect of economic policies. As part of this chapter, Jenkins listed a series of changes for the better that could be achieved by a determined, reforming Home Secretary. These included the abolition of the death penalty, as well as reform in the laws on homosexuality, abortion, divorce, and state censorship. People like me, born in the 1960s, might feel a particularly strong sense of dissonance reading about Britain in the 50s. It feels to me particularly backward-looking, ridiculously mired in class and tradition, exceptionally old-fashioned. I think that feels less surprising to people who are much younger than me. Of course the 1950s were old-fashioned, they say. That's like the olden times. For myself, though, these aren't the olden times. These are the times that my parents got married in. I grew up less than a decade or two later, and yet that world was effectively gone by then. I feel very lucky to have missed it, like a narrow escape. Even before he wrote the Labour case, Jenkins had already been doing what he could to pursue his agenda. He had been the MP who had proposed the bill in the Commons that would become law as the Obscene Publications Act of 1959. This act allowed a defence against censorship for the first time on the grounds of public good or on the grounds of artistic merit. Jenkins would later be called as a witness for the defence in the notorious trial on Lady Chatterley's lover. This was the man, then, who Harold Wilson appointed to be Home Secretary at the end of 1965. And he was determined to make use of his position to move Britain in the direction of a more civilised society. The suspension of capital punishment had passed through Parliament earlier that year and was just coming into effect. There had been a notice board in the Home Secretary's office when he arrived, in which they had used to record the details of upcoming executions for capital crimes. Jenkins replaced it with a drinks cabinet. It was less than 2 years later that Jenkins moved out of the Home Office to become Chancellor of the Exchequer. But in those 2 short years, he achieved a huge amount. Abortion was legalised. Homosexuality was decriminalised. The NHS Family Planning Act of 1967 allowed family health clinics to offer contraceptive advice to unmarried women for the first time. The Lord Chamberlain's power to censor the theatre was ended, and racial discrimination in employment was banned. These last 2 were set in motion by Jenkins, but he had left the Home Office before they were passed by Parliament. It was his successor, James Callaghan, who inherited those from him. Jenkins was furious when the 1968 Race Relations Act allowed an exemption for the police force. They could continue to be as racist as they liked. It would be another 31 years before that was fully corrected. Reform of the law on divorce was an ongoing but long-winded process that was set in motion before Jenkins became Home Secretary and did not bear fruit until after he had moved on. The newly formed Law Commission had been tasked with a review of divorce law early in 1965, and that would eventually lead to the 1969 Divorce Reform Act, which introduced no-fault divorces on the grounds of marital breakdown. Jenkins returned to the Home Office for another 2 years in the mid-70s and managed to extend the Race Relations Act to include private clubs, as well as shepherding through the Sex Discrimination Act of 1975, which made it illegal for employers to discriminate on the grounds of sex or marital status. It's easy in hindsight to get the false impression that these reforms were an inevitable product of changing times and changing attitudes. The truth is that many of them were deeply unpopular with senior Labour Party MPs, and Jenkins had to fight hard to push them through against considerable opposition. Things like the reform on homosexuality or on abortion were certainly not Labour Party policy, and they did not arrive in Parliament as government-sponsored bills. They were private members' bills, which always face a difficult passage through the House. In the UK Parliament, a private member's bill is one introduced by a member of the Commons or Lords who is not a minister. Little parliamentary time is normally available to such bills, and only a tiny minority ever become law. Jenkins spoke in the House in support of these bills and voted for them at every stage, but his most important gift was that he fought for them to have parliamentary time. By fighting in Cabinet for these bills to be given the extra debate time that they required, he was able to use his position to avoid them failing, as other attempts at such reform had previously. It was no coincidence that these particular private members' bills happened to be proposed. The team at the Home Office actively approached MPs to suggest them. David Steele, who would later be leader of the Liberal Party, remembers being asked if he would be willing to put forward a bill on either homosexuality or abortion. He chose abortion. I've been thinking about this recently, about how political change happens, and about how well or poorly the government keeps step with the people that it governs, and about how rare it is to see people like Jenkins who successfully pursue agendas that lack strong support within their own party. Jenkins said in a speech once that politics is not only the art of the possible, it is also the art of making possible tomorrow what may seem impossible today. A case could easily be made that Jenkins was pursuing a personal agenda with no real mandate to do so from the electorate. These reforms had not been part of the Labour manifesto in the election. Polls suggested that the public were deeply divided on issues like homosexuality or abortion. Thanks to Jenkins' efforts, the UK liberalised on these issues earlier than many of our European neighbours. Yes, I'm sure that change would eventually have come without him, but it might easily have been decades later. Lacking a strong mandate at the time, did Jenkins really have the right to use his position of political influence to force through a personal agenda? When challenged on this in later years, Jenkins would point out that he had no power to force through anything. By ensuring that the bills had time to pass through Parliament, all he was doing was allowing MPs to vote on them. It was the MPs themselves who voted in favour, and not just Labour MPs either, since many of these were votes of conscience with no strong party whip on either side. I think that it's possible to flip this argument on its head and view things from another angle. People in Parliament do have the power to push for change, but they very rarely have the power to actually force change to happen. What they actually do have, far more often, is the power to effectively block change. Devout Catholics and other MPs who opposed abortion reform could block private members' bills by filibustering and talking them out, standing firm in debate for long enough that the bill ran out of time. The ability of MPs with a personal agenda to block such legislation was the reason why the active support of the Home Secretary was so necessary. The people who had blocked previous change had no firmer mandate than Jenkins had. All he was doing was levelling the playing field for once. Researching all of this, and reading in more detail about the dealings of the Cabinet of the time, I was struck by what fragile coalitions political parties tend to be. The necessity of holding the party together and preventing revolt from one side or the other seems to hem ministers in to a very narrow channel of political possibility. A party is not actually made up of people who all agree with each other and believe the same thing. It's the opposite of that. An angry hornet's nest with wildly incompatible views and positions who have temporarily agreed to put aside their differences for long enough to gain access to political power and so pursue the changes they wish to make, or prevent the changes they wish to avoid. But this model of a fragile and volatile coalition does not just apply to political parties. It's the women's movement. It's any group advocating for or against the rights of LGBT people. It's probably true of the board of many charities. being willing to work alongside people we might disagree with is essential to achieving almost any change, or in organising anything. Navigating the tensions inherent in these groups is a massively valuable skill. The balancing act of when to compromise and when to stand firm is how that tightrope is traversed. The web of private member bills and personal favours that Jenkins used to progress his agenda reminded me again of the way that community groups work. Not by obediently following the instructions of a leader, but by bringing together a group of people in a common cause and trying to coordinate their efforts to be more effective. The other thing I found myself thinking about, reading about Britain in the 1950s and reflecting on how alien it feels to me now, was how my grandchildren will come to think about the world of the 2020s. What is it in today's society that will feel impossibly old-fashioned to them when they are my age? I'm not thinking about technological change here, but about culture and society, about attitudes. I would love to know what their future will make of us. I would love to know what they will make of themselves. Anyway, that's what I was thinking about, and it felt worth sharing. See you soon.